A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, today's prompt from Daniel is about the gap between marketing and reality in end-to-end encryption. He's asking the million-dollar question. How do we actually know these apps aren't just pinky promising while they're quietly siphoning off our private keys through a backdoor in the UI?
It is a massive topic, Corn, and honestly, the timing couldn't be better. We're living in this era where E2EE has become a buzzword that companies slap on their landing pages like a certified organic sticker, but the technical plumbing underneath is often a black box. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is fitting because we're talking about the intersection of high-level claims and the messy reality of code.
It reminds me of that whole WhatsApp privacy policy blow-up back in 21. Millions of people panicked and bolted for Signal or Telegram because they thought Facebook was going to start reading their texts. But if you ask the average person who switched how they knows, Signal is actually more secure, they'd probably just say, well, the internet told me so. They aren't exactly auditing the source code between sips of coffee.
And that's the vulnerability right there. Trust. In a true end-to-end encrypted system, you shouldn't have to trust the provider at all. The math should do the heavy lifting. But as Daniel points out, the user interface is the bridge between the human and the math. And if that bridge is rigged, the math doesn't matter. Herman Poppleberry here, and I've been digging into some of the documented cases where these secure walls turned out to be made of painted cardboard.
Before we get into the horror stories, let's establish the baseline. When a company says end-to-end encrypted, what is the specific technical promise they are making, and where does that promise usually break down?
The promise is simple. The keys required to decrypt the data are generated and stored exclusively on the user's device. The service provider acts only as a blind courier. They see an encrypted blob of data, they pass it to the recipient, and only the recipient has the key to turn that blob back into a cat meme or a bank statement. The breakdown happens at the key management layer. If the app generates the key but then helpfully backs it up to the company's server so you don't lose your messages when you get a new iPhone, that's not true E2EE anymore. That's just encryption at rest with a fancy hat on.
So the helpful features are often the Trojan horses. It's like a locksmith who gives you a high-security deadbolt, but then says, "Don't worry, I kept a master key in my drawer just in case you lock yourself out." It defeats the entire purpose of the lock.
Well, not exactly, but you've hit the nail on the head. A big red flag is server-side key escrow. If you can recover your account using just a password or an email link without a physical recovery code you stored offline, the provider has a way to access your keys. They have to.
But wait, how do they justify that to the regulators? If they claim it's E2EE, but they have a recovery path, isn't that false advertising?
They use semantic gymnastics. They'll say the transmission is end-to-end encrypted, which is technically true while the packet is moving. But they conveniently gloss over the fact that the end isn't just your phone, it's also their backup server. It's like saying a armored truck is impenetrable while it's driving, but it parks every night in a garage where the landlord has the keys to the back door.
Okay, so if I'm a technical user, or at least a curious one, how do I peek under the hood? Daniel wants to know how to verify these tools aren't extracting keys. What's the standard procedure for catching a secure app in a lie?
It starts with network traffic analysis. You use a tool like Wireshark or Burp Suite to watch every single packet leaving your device. If I send a message, I should see an encrypted payload going to the server. But I should also look for phone home signals. Is the app sending metadata or, heaven forbid, a copy of the private key to an undocumented API endpoint? One of the most sophisticated ways to hide this is through steganography in the UI traffic, hiding bits of your key inside seemingly normal telemetry data.
That sounds like something out of a spy novel. You're saying an app could hide my private key inside a crash report or a user engagement ping.
It's technically possible. Think about a standard crash report. It usually includes a stack trace or a dump of the app state at the moment it failed. If the developers were being malicious or just incredibly reckless, that dump could include the memory space where your private key is currently unwrapped and active. If that report is sent over a standard HTTPS connection to their analytics server, your key just left the building.
That makes the reproducible builds point you mentioned earlier even more vital. Walk me through that process. If I'm not a coder, why should I care if the bits match?
This is a big one for the open source community. Even if a company publishes their source code on GitHub, how do you know the version you downloaded from the App Store actually matches that code? A reproducible build allows a third party to compile the source code and get a binary that is bit for bit identical to the one in the store. Signal does this for Android, which is a huge gold standard. If the bits don't match, the company could have injected a key exfiltration module into the official version while keeping the public code clean.
So if it's not open source and doesn't have reproducible builds, we're basically just taking their word for it. Which brings us to the Mirage, part of Daniel's prompt. Have there been instances where this trust was explicitly betrayed?
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about the 2020 WhatsApp vulnerability, documented as CVE 2020-1910. This was a buffer overflow flaw where a hacker or a state actor could send a specially crafted video file that, when processed by the app, allowed them to gain access to the device's memory. Once you're in the memory, the end-to-end part is irrelevant. You just grab the keys while they're hot and in use.
But was that a deliberate backdoor or just a bug? Because there's a difference between a ruse and just being bad at coding.
In that case, it was officially a bug, but it highlights the endpoint security problem. E2EE only protects data in transit. If the end is compromised, the encryption is a moot point. However, there are more deceptive examples. Look at how some secure messaging apps handle cloud backups. iMessage is a classic example of this tension. The messages are E2EE between devices, but for years, if you turned on iCloud backup, Apple held the key to that backup. So, if the government came with a warrant, Apple couldn't give them the live stream, but they could give them the backup. They finally introduced advanced data protection in late 2022 to fix this, but for over a decade, the end-to-end claim had a footnote the size of a mountain.
It's the opt-out security model. They give you the shiny privacy shield, but they leave the backdoor unlocked by default for convenience. What about the more malicious stuff? Daniel mentioned tools being used as a deceptive ruse.
There was a fascinating case involving an app called Anim. This wasn't a mainstream app. It was marketed specifically to criminal underworlds as the ultimate encrypted phone. It turned out the entire platform was a sting operation run by the FBI and the Australian Federal Police. They had a master key built into the encryption protocol from day one. Every secure message sent by cartels and syndicates was being read in real time by law enforcement. They processed 27 million messages over 3 years. That is the ultimate Mirage. The encryption was real in the sense that no one else could read it, but the provider was the police.
That's wild. It's the ultimate honeypot. It makes you wonder about all these random secure VPNs and unbreakable chat apps that pop up on social media. If you are paying for the product, or even if you are, who's actually auditing the keys?
And it's not just the police. Think about the corporate side. There are plenty of enterprise secure communication tools that market themselves as E2EE to employees, but the company's IT department holds a secondary escrow key for compliance reasons. If the boss wants to see what you're saying, they don't need to crack the encryption, they just use the key they already have. The UI looks identical to a truly private app, but the reality is complete surveillance.
And that's where Daniel's point about crypto recovery scams comes in. We're seeing a rise in recovery firms that claim they can use proprietary AI tools to crack encrypted wallets or recover stolen Bitcoin. Most of these are just secondary scams. They tell you they need a deposit for server time or gas fees, and then they vanish. They use the language of high-end encryption to sound legitimate, but they're just exploiting the fact that most people don't understand how asymmetrical encryption works. If you lose your private key to a truly encrypted wallet, it is gone. There is no backdoor, unless the developer put one there. Let's circle back to the verification side. You mentioned Wireshark and reproducible builds, but what about the metadata? I remember reading that even if the content is encrypted, the who, when, and where can be just as damaging.
Metadata is the silent killer. This is why Signal's sealed sender protocol, which they rolled out in 2018, was such a big deal. In a normal encrypted chat, the server still needs to know who is sending the message to whom so it can route it. Sealed sender encrypts the sender's identity as well, so the server only knows the destination. Most secure apps don't do this. They brag about E2EE for the text, but they're still logging your entire social graph, who you talk to, how often, and from what IP address.
It's like sending a letter in a titanium box, but the envelope still has your return address and the recipient's address written in big red letters. The post office doesn't know what's in the box, but they know you're talking to a private investigator or a rival company.
Or imagine you're a whistleblower talking to a journalist. The government doesn't need to know what you said to convict you of leaking. They just need to prove that you, a person with a security clearance, sent a 5-megabyte file to a known investigative reporter at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The metadata is the smoking gun.
And if you look at the Russian crackdown on Telegram in 2018, the authorities weren't always cracking the encryption. They were using metadata and device compromise. Telegram has this cloud chat feature, which is the default. Those are not end-to-end encrypted in the way people think. The keys are stored by Telegram. Only secret chats use their MT, Proto 2.0, E2, EE. Most users don't know the difference. They see the secure branding and assume everything is locked down. That's a Mirage by omission. So, if a user wants to be proactive, what are the red flags in a UI that might suggest something fishy is going on with their keys?
First red flag. If the app asks you to sync your messages to a new device without requiring the old device to be present or using a physical setup key. If it just happens automatically after you type in SMS code, your keys are living on their server. Second, mandatory cloud backups that don't explicitly state they are client-side encrypted. Third, if the security code or fingerprint verification, that thing where you compare a string of numbers with your friend, is hidden deep in a menu or non-existent. That's your only way to verify there isn't a man-in-the-middle attack.
Wait, can you explain that man-in-the-middle check? I think I've seen those QR codes in Signal and WhatsApp, but I usually just ignore them. How does that actually prove the keys haven't been siphoned?
It's the most important manual check you can do. When you start a chat, your phone and your friend's phone exchange public keys. The app then generates a unique fingerprint based on those two keys. If a hacker or the app provider is intercepting the chat, they are actually sitting in the middle. Your phone thinks it's talking to your friend, but it's actually talking to the hacker's key. The hacker then re-encrypts the message and sends it to your friend. If you compare those fingerprints in person and they don't match, it means someone has swapped a key in the middle. If the app makes it hard to find that fingerprint, they're basically saying, trust us, don't verify.
I've noticed a lot of apps are now pushing passkeys and biometric unlocks. Does that make the E2EE more or less verifiable?
It makes it more convenient, but it adds another layer of abstraction. Passkeys are great because they use public key cryptography, but again, it depends on where the private half of that passkey is stored. If it's synced through a provider's keychain, you're back to trusting that provider's security. It's a constant tug of war between usable and verifiable.
What's the deal with the EU's Digital Markets Act? I saw you had a note about that. Does that help or hurt the encryption transparency?
It's a double-edged sword. The DMA, which really kicked into gear in January 2024, requires gatekeepers, like WhatsApp and Messenger, to be interoperable with smaller apps. This sounds great for competition, but it's a nightmare for E2EE. How do you maintain a secure end-to-end pipe when the data has to jump from Signal's protocol to a third-party app with unknown security standards? There's a risk that interoperability becomes the excuse for weakening encryption standards across the board.
We had to build a bridge, so we had to lower the toll gate. It's the classic regulatory trap. We want privacy, but we also want everything to talk to everything else. You can't have both without a massive amount of technical overhead that most companies won't bother with.
And that brings us back to Daniel's core concern, the deceptive ruse. If a company is forced by law to provide a backdoor, like what we've seen discussed in the UK's Online Safety Act, they might still keep the end-to-end encrypted label on the box while technically implementing what's called ghost man in the middle. This is where the service provider silently adds an extra invisible recipient to your encrypted group chat. Your app encrypts the message for your friend, sand, for the government's key. The UI shows you're talking to one person, but the math says you're talking to two.
That is terrifying because it's mathematically correct, E2EE, but the end has been redefined without your knowledge. How do you verify that?
You'd have to audit the key exchange process in real time. You'd need to see every public key your app is fetching for a conversation. If you're in a one-on-one chat but your app is fetching two public keys, you know something is wrong. But again, who is doing that? Not your grandma, not even most tech-savvy people. We rely on independent researchers and reproducible builds to act as the canaries in the coal mine.
It feels like the trustless dream of crypto and encryption is slowly being eroded by the sheer complexity of the modern stack. We've gone from don't trust, verify, to please hope the guys on Reddit verified it for you.
It really is. And we should mention the quantum elephant in the room. As we move closer to Q-Day, the point where quantum computers can crack standard RSA and elliptic curve encryption, we're seeing apps roll out quantum-resistant algorithms. Signal and iMessage have already started this. But this transition period is a perfect time for mirages. A company can claim they are quantum secure, but implement a flawed version of the Kyber or dilithium algorithms or leave the classic non-secure backdoor wide open for legacy support.
It's the new and improved marketing trap, now with quantum protection. But the private keys are still being sent to a server in a plain text crash report.
Well, not exactly, but you're right. The takeaway here for Daniel and everyone else is that encryption isn't a binary on-off switch. It's a spectrum of implementation. If you really care about your keys not being extracted, you have to look for three things: open source with reproducible builds, a no-cloud backup default, and a history of resisting subpoenas. Signal is still the leader here because they literally have nothing to give when the feds show up. They've proven it in court multiple times. Their metadata is so sparse they can only say, this account was created on this date and last seen on this date. That is the only real verification that matters, when the company is legally forced to cough up data and they can't.
That's a powerful benchmark. I'll believe your encryption when the FBI is mad at you. It's a bit of a cynical way to live, but in the world of data privacy, cynicism is a survival trait.
It really is. And for those who want to get hands-on, I'd recommend playing around with certificate pinning. This is a technique where an app is hard-coded to only talk to a specific server certificate. If a government or a hacker tries to intercept your traffic with a fake certificate, the app refuses to connect. You can actually test if your apps are doing this by trying to run them through a proxy, like Charles Proxy. If the app just works and lets you see the traffic, it's not pinning certificates and it's vulnerable to interception.
I love that. It's like a litmus test for security. If the app is too easy to man, in the middle it's probably not as secure as the brochure says.
And watch out for sync features. If you can log into a web browser and see your encrypted messages without your phone being turned on and connected to the internet, those messages are sitting on a server somewhere in a format the server can read. WhatsApp Web and Telegram Desktop, unless you're using very specific settings, are often the weak link, where the encryption mirage falls apart for the sake of convenience.
It sounds like we're moving toward a world where true privacy requires a level of friction that most people just won't tolerate. If I have to carry a physical YubiKey and manually verify fingerprints for every single contact, I'm probably just going to go back to sending postcards.
That's exactly what the big tech companies are banking on. They know that 99% of users will choose the Mirage of security if the alternative requires 5 extra taps in the settings menu. They market the privacy, but they build the convenience, and the gap between those two things is where the data leaks out.
This has been a bit of a black pill episode, but I think it's necessary. The E2EE label is being used as a shield by companies that don't always have our best interests at heart. Daniel's right to be skeptical. If you can't see the keys, and you can verify the build, you're just a passenger on someone else's plane.
And some of those planes are built by the police, as we saw with Onum. Always check who owns the airline.
Well, On that cheery note, I think we've given Daniel enough to chew on. It's about looking past the UI and demanding transparency in the plumbing.
And keeping your private keys private. If a tool manages them for you, they aren't your keys anymore. They're a joint account with a stranger.
Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our script generation and keep this whole human sloth donkey AI collaboration alive.
If you found this dive into the Encryption Mirage useful, or if it just made you want to throw your phone in a river, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the Skeptical Nerd Club.
This has been My Weird Prompts. You can find all 1,700 plus episodes and the RSS feed at myweirdprompts.com.
Stay paranoid out there.
Or at least, stay verified. Bye.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth